And the wetlands would normally have been a process whereby there would have been some cleansing of that taking place. It goes through the wetlands and it comes out more purified into the river systems, etc. But what happens when the wetlands are destroyed, where we poison a certain amount of water that can never really be fully recycled?
What we now know is that we are polluting and depleting this finite stock of fresh water so fast that we're now mining the groundwater faster than it can be replenished.
It rains. The water hits the ground and percolates into the soil, collecting underground into what are known as aquifers or groundwater. But how much of our finite supply of water is underground? We can only estimate, as there is no reliable method to accurately measure, which is why our growing dependency on groundwater is such an urgent concern.
The fabled Atlantis in the Middle East had a real city attached to it. It was called Ubar. It disappeared and no one could figure out what happened. And then some archaeologists found it. What they realized is it collapsed into the desert sand from groundwater pumping. Not only could it happen, it is happening today in Florida. Giant sinkholes have emerged, all of a sudden just big cavities in the ground opening up.
The effects are not always evident, as with a sinkhole or lost city. Entire regions can slowly and evenly sink as a watershed is depleted.
Perfect example is where Mexico City is now. There was once an oasis of water. When the Spanish came, they didn't want their new city to look like Venice. They wanted it to look like Madrid. And they used slave labor to cut down all the trees that would protect the water sources and to dredge the water systems. And what happened was that they just destroyed the water table. And of course, that was one thing when there were 10,000 people living there. It's another when there are, maybe 25 million. They've taken the rest of the water underneath the city. The city is literally sinking in on itself, and these great big churches are beginning to, go sideways. And Mexico is having to go further and further and further away from its local water sources, because there aren't any left, to find water.
Human ingenuity has found out ways to get water from beneath the surface of the earth for thousands of years. What's changed, though, is the technology. We now pump approximately 30 billion gallons of groundwater every day. The farming community started tapping into our aquifers at a time when there really were not other demands on the resource. The way that the law works is that they're allowed to use limitless quantities. And then the added kicker is that the law said, if you don't use it, if you don't divert all of this water, you may lose your water right.
So with that scenario, it doesn't encourage conservation of water. I mean, why am I going to go ahead and quit pumping to save water and lose everything? So then a guy like me who may want to quit pumping to quit depleting the aquifer, I have to keep pumping in order to keep my water rights.
When we pump water for such irrigation, some of it percolates back into the ground, which is called recharge or return flows. So long as we pump no more than what is recharged, we are using the groundwater sustainably. The problem is that we're pumping up to 15 times more water from the ground than is returning back into it, creating a global crisis.
One thing that most people don't know is that the world is desertifying very quickly. We are becoming a desert in many places.
Our soil is eroding, simply meaning that overgrazing, winds, and flooding damage the top layer of Earth, essentially hardening it to the point that rainwater cannot easily soak into the ground. Our life source literally slips away from us, back into the ocean through sewers and rivers, draining the land of its moisture and life.
Že krajina, ktorú človek vysušuje, sa mení zo zelenej na žltú a výsledkom potom je, že všetká voda je skumulovaná v oceáne.
Extreme weather, a world of hurricanes and violent storms over the ocean, while the interior land receives less and less rain, or violent, harsh storms that simply erode the land more.
Zemská kôra kontinentu odľahčuje a príspevok kumulácie tejto vody v oceánoch spôsobuje zaťaženie zemskej pôdy, čo môže spôsobiť pnutie v štruktúrach zemskej kôry a to spôsobuje zemetrasenia, potenciálne možné tsunami vlny, ktoré sme boli svedkami v roku 2004.
Deforestation is a major contributor to soil erosion. Tree roots absorb water and thus hold the watershed in place. When they leave the land, so does the water.
Because the forests that held the water have all been logged. There is no place where the water can be stored. The rain still comes and runs away as instant surface runoff.
Just what I feared. He's formed a gang, and they're whooping it up for a flash flood. They're rushing down the canyon. They've made a wall of water 20 feet high. Look out! No longer satisfied with flash floods, the gang is planning bigger and wetter floods. Junior's getting dangerous. He's getting tougher and bolder every day.
But groundwater pumping cannot alone be blamed for our desertification crisis.
Cities are growing and expanding. For the first time in human history, more people living in cities than in the countryside.
We've replaced permeable ground with hardscape, with roofs, with parking lots, with homes.
If it rains and the water doesn't hit the ground but hits the sidewalk or street instead, it can't soak into the ground and make trees. It just slides down the street back to the ocean and makes more clouds. This means that the ground gets really dry and the grass and trees die.
Clearly, there is much more unpaved than paved land in the world, but the effect is cumulative and should not be underestimated.
Celosvetovo zhruba 750 miliard kubíkov vody. Tento proces sa odštartoval po druhej svetovej vojne. Dá sa povedať, že teraz sme v polčase rozpadu vodného cyklu a o 50 rokov bude vlastne definitívny kolaps s vodnými zdrojami na globálnej úrovni.
There is another problem with increased urbanization, which is our continued insistence to build housing for growing populations that demand more water than local watersheds can provide.
People in the housing development, and they make money by turning houses, and they're very large companies. So their goal is to avoid the water issue that might limit the number of houses they might have.
Instead of adapting our development to the available water supply of a region, we choose to force the world's water supply to adapt to our desired locations.
What dams do is change the hydrologic cycle. They provide water during those months when the natural flow patterns do not.
What's happened is that we built these huge hydro dams mainly to create hydropower and hydroelectricity. And when we've done that, we've done it in a very narrow framework, and we haven't thought about the fact we're going to need water for other purposes.
In this quest to conquer nature, as some label it, we've constructed close to 50,000 large dams worldwide. But if we are headed towards desertification by allowing too much rainwater to run off into the sea, then is it not to our benefit to dam water and prevent it from reaching the sea?
One of the basic functions of rivers is to carry stuff from one place to another. And that stuff, which is really critical to the health of an entire watershed, it becomes completely and wholly interrupted when you build a dam.
Dammed rivers fail to carry such nutrients and minerals downstream through the watershed, resulting in more soil erosion. Less percolation when it rains, more runoff, and thus an increase in the desertification problem.
When you trap water, it stops moving, and when it stops moving, it heats up because it's this nice, warm soup full of nutrients that are not making it downstream. But then those things die, and then they eat up oxygen. All of a sudden, you've got a major water quality